Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. Today, let's talk about Chinese drones, specifically by DJI, because now they can fly over the White House, airports, power plants, military bases, etc., etc. No real restrictions anymore. Now, there's a really good write-up on this from The Verge, and let's talk about what's going on, because I'm not a big fan of this, and if you are a longtime listener or follower of mine, you know I've talked about drones and specifically DJI and other Chinese-made drones before. But for over a decade, you really couldn't easily fly your DJI drone over a restricted area across the United States. DJI software basically had geofencing and would automatically stop you from flying over airports, power plants, public emergencies like wildfires, the White House, etc., etc. But interestingly enough, and kind of confusingly, amidst the greatest U.S. outpouring of drone distrust in years, and even an incident where a DJI drone operator was hindering LA wildfire fighting efforts, we'll talk about that, DJI just decided to get rid of the geofence just in time for a new administration, which is why I think they're doing this, even though they're not saying. Now, here's what's going on. DJI will no longer enforce no-fly zones and only offer basically a dismissible warning. Meaning, as you're flying there, it might prompt you to say, hey, wait a second, you probably shouldn't be flying over that airport or the White House or whatever. But you can essentially dismiss that. So essentially only common sense, empathy, fear of getting caught, whatever that is going to prevent people from flying where they shouldn't. Now, in a blog post, DJI characterizes this as, quote, placing control back in the hands of drone operators, end quote. DJI suggests that technologies like remote ID, which publicly broadcasts a location of a drone, and their operator during flight are, quote, providing authorities with the tools needed to enforce existing rules. That's according to DJI Global Head of Policy, Adam Welsh. So, it turns out, for the record, that the DJI drone that damaged the Super Scooper airplane that was fighting the LA wildfires was what is known as a sub 250 gram model. And so it may not be required to have that remote ID to operate. And the FBI, who is investigating that, expects they're going to have to, quote, work backwards through investigative means, end quote, to figure out who actually flew it there. If you recall, it basically was hindering operations as they're trying to get the Palisades fire under control, which is still a complete mess and still only partially contained. Now, DJI is voluntarily creating its geofencing feature, but it also makes certain to a certain degree that the company would get rid of it now that the U.S. government no longer seems to either appreciate or want its help, and it's blocking some of its drone imports. So essentially the U.S. government was calling DJI a Chinese military company, and so they've essentially started a countdown clock on this import ban. Quote, the FAA does not require geofencing from drone manufacturers, according to the FAA's spokesperson, Ian McGregor. And so here we are. And I think this is actually something that's going to be really interesting. Now, the reason why I said earlier is I think this is because, we have a new incoming administration, Trump, or soon to be President-elect Trump, basically has had kind of a love-hate relationship with China. And by virtue of that, China has essentially been targeted as, one of the biggest issues and threats that we have in the United States. I actually think that is true in many ways. I mean, look at Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, et cetera, et cetera. But drones have always been a bit of a problem here, especially because DJI, being a Chinese company, was automatically allowing users or operators of these drones to stream back to DJI's cloud, which was hosted in China, or was giving the Chinese authorities access to that cloud. So you flew it near that military base, for example, which was one example from a while ago. And essentially what you're doing is flying reconnaissance for the Chinese government, whether you realize it or not. Maybe not what you wanted to do, but you are. And so if they're now allowing this back in because, if the letter of the law says, all we need is a dismissible warning and we have remote ID, but not all of them need remote ID, but we're not really talking about that, we're ending up in a disaster. Drones can be weaponized. We've seen that all throughout the Ukraine war, as the Ukrainians have been very effective at using drones to counter the Russian offensive. And so by virtue of that, these could be surveillance. These drones could be potentially shot down as well, especially if they're going over no-fly zones. The other side of it is these could potentially cause chaos. Some idiot tries to fly one of these things over like O'Hare Airport or Hartfield Jackson in Atlanta or some massive airport. And by virtue of that, what do? They hit a plane, they cause an incident. These are these kinds of issues, and the Chinese government would have no problem with that whatsoever. And so I think by virtue of it, it's coming just in time for a new administration, which will cause some mess, cause some chaos. And as we know, basically under the first Trump administration, there was a trade war ramped up with China. Was simmering. We're expecting that to be ramped up again as the incoming president has talked about tariffs, etc. And so why not? Why not do this? And so we'll see what happens here. But honestly, I'm not a big fan. I think this should be law that you should not be able to fly basically like unregistered drones or even stuff with IDs through what should be restricted airspace, whether it's a White House, a power plant, a military base, and definitely a commercial airport. So here we are. We're going to see what happens, but quite frankly, I think we're going to see a lot more incidents with drones going where they shouldn't go because, quite frankly, if it's an on your honor thing and based up to the operator, there's going to be a lot of people that just don't care. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. Just don't surveil me. You can also subscribe at YouTube, which you should. Same with Blue Sky and Mastodon. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, please, please attempt to stay private and informed. Take care.